They erased us from our own story. They painted our faces white and called it history.
Let me stop you right there, because somebody lied to you. Somebody lied to your parents. Somebody lied to their parents, and they did it with a straight face, a painting on a chapel ceiling, and 500 years of repetition. The original Israelites were black people, African people, dark-skinned, kinky-haired, melanated people from the northeastern corner of Africa and the ancient Near East. That is not an opinion. That is archaeology. That is linguistics. That is the Bible itself. If you actually read the thing instead of just looking at the pictures somebody else painted for you, let us start at the very beginning. Not the beginning somebody handed you in Sunday school. The actual beginning. The land of Canaan, where the Israelites emerged as a people, sits at the crossroads of Africa and Asia. It borders Egypt directly. The Sinai Peninsula connects them like a land bridge. These were not European landscapes populated by pale-skinned people with blue eyes and flowing brown hair. This was a hot, sun-scorched, ancient Near Eastern world, populated by people who look like the people who have always lived in that region. Dark, brown, black. The ancient Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the early Hebrews, they were all variations of the same melanated stock. The ancient world knew this. It was only the modern world that forgot it on purpose. Look at the earliest physical descriptions we have. The Bible itself describes the patriarch Joseph being sold into Egypt and immediately blending in so completely that his own brothers could not recognize him. His own brothers. Men who had lived with him their entire lives. If Joseph had been a pale-skinned, light-eyed, distinctly European-looking man walking into ancient Egypt, he would have stood out like a lighthouse in a swamp. Instead, he blended in. He looked like the Egyptians, because the Egyptians and the Israelites looked like each other, because they were the same kind of people. Then you have Moses. Moses, the great liberator, the man who parted the Red Sea and brought down the 10 Commandments. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household as an Egyptian prince, not as a curiosity, not as an oddity, as a prince. He passed so completely that nobody questioned his identity until he himself revealed it. In Exodus chapter 2, Moses flees Egypt and arrives in Midian. He sits down by a well. The daughters of the priest of Midian come to water their flocks. Other shepherds drive them away. Moses defends the women and draws water for them. The women go home, and their father asks them, "Where is this man? Why did you leave him?" And what do the daughters say? They say, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds." They looked at Moses, and they saw an Egyptian, not a foreigner, not a strange pale man from some other world, an Egyptian. Moses looked Egyptian. Moses was black. And that is just 2 chapters into Exodus. The evidence is not buried. It is sitting right there on the surface, waiting for somebody to actually read the text with their eyes open. Now let us talk about what archaeology has been quietly confirming for decades while the mainstream narrative tried to keep the volume turned down. The ancient Israelites left material culture behind: pottery, burial sites, inscriptions, and the physical remains that archaeologists have pulled from the ground in the Levant, in ancient Canaan, in the areas we now call Israel and Palestine, consistently show a population that was phenotypically similar to other ancient Near Eastern and Northeastern African peoples. The Amarna letters, written in the 14th century before the Common Era, describe the people of Canaan in terms that align with a population that was deeply intertwined with Egypt. The DNA studies done on ancient remains from the Levant, published in journals like Nature and Current Biology, show genetic profiles that cluster with ancient Egyptian and northeastern African populations, not European populations, not the populations that would later come to define the face of European Christianity. The Egyptians themselves left us pictures, thousands of them, painted on tomb walls, carved into temple reliefs. The ancient Egyptians depicted themselves with red-brown to dark brown skin. They depicted Nubians with very dark brown to black skin. And they depicted the Asiatics, the people from Canaan and the surrounding regions, with skin tones that ranged from olive to brown. The Israelites would have fallen into that same visual spectrum. The ancient world's own artists told us exactly what everyone looked like. We just stopped looking at their testimony and started looking at Michelangelo's instead. Michelangelo. Let us talk about that for a moment. The Sistine Chapel ceiling was painted between 1508 and 1512. Michelangelo was Italian. He was painting for a pope. He was working within a European cultural context that had, by that point, spent centuries systematically remaking the ancient Hebrews in a European image. By the time Michelangelo picked up his brush, the transformation was already well underway. The Council of Nicaea, in 325 of the Common Era, had already begun the process of institutionalizing Christianity as a Roman imperial religion. And Rome had a very specific idea of what power looked like, what civilization looked like, what God looked like. It looked like them. So they made God look like them. They made Jesus look like them. They made Abraham and Moses and David and Solomon look like them. And then they painted those images on every wall, printed them in every Bible, and distributed them to every corner of a world they were busy conquering. This is not conspiracy theory. This is art history. This is the documented history of iconography. Scholars of religious art have traced the evolution of how biblical figures were depicted across centuries. The earliest known images of Jesus, found in the Roman catacombs from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, show a dark complexioned, short-haired figure. The Coptic Christians of Egypt, who trace their faith directly back to the earliest days of Christianity, have always depicted Jesus and the biblical figures with dark skin. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, has maintained an unbroken tradition of depicting biblical figures as Black Africans, because to them, that was not a theological statement. That was just what they looked like. Now let us go deeper into the text, because the Bible is actually full of descriptions and references that make the African and dark-skinned identity of the Israelites impossible to ignore if you are reading carefully. The Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5. The speaker says, "I am black and beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon." The Hebrew word used there is shahor. It means black, not tanned, not olive, black. And the speaker is not ashamed of this. The speaker is stating it as a fact alongside a declaration of beauty. I am black and beautiful. Not I am black, but beautiful and beautiful. Both things at once. Because in the ancient world of the Israelites, being black was not a problem. It was just a description. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 21. Jeremiah cries out, "For the hurt of the daughter of my people am I hurt? I am black." The prophet Jeremiah, in a moment of anguish, identifies himself by his complexion. He says, "I am black," not metaphorically, not symbolically, as a descriptor of his physical self in a moment of grief and solidarity with his people. Job chapter 30, verse 30. Job says, "My skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with heat." Now, yes, Job is describing affliction. But the fact that he describes his skin turning black as something notable tells you something about his baseline. His skin was already dark. The darkening was a change, not a transformation from pale to dark. This was a man whose skin was already in a range where turning darker was a meaningful physical descriptor. Numbers, chapter 12. Moses marries a Cushite woman. Cush is the ancient name for the region south of Egypt, roughly corresponding to modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. His sister Miriam objects to this marriage. God becomes angry with Miriam and strikes her with a skin condition that turns her skin white as snow. The text uses the whitening of the skin as a punishment, as something shocking and terrible. If the Israelites had been a pale-skinned people to begin with, why would turning white be a punishment? Why would it be presented as something horrifying? Because in the context of their world, their community, their understanding of beauty and normalcy, white skin was not the standard. It was the aberration. It was the curse. Let us talk about the Lemba people of Southern Africa. The Lemba are a Bantu-speaking people living in Zimbabwe and South Africa. They have maintained 4 generations an oral tradition claiming descent from ancient Israelites who migrated south through Africa. Scholars and geneticists initially dismissed this as folk mythology. Then, in 1999, a study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics examined the Y chromosome DNA of the Lemba. What they found was extraordinary. A significant portion of Lemba men carried the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic marker associated with the ancient Jewish priestly class. The Kohanim, the descendants of Aaron. The Lemba, a black African people, carried genetic evidence of ancient Israelite ancestry at rates comparable to or exceeding those found in modern Jewish populations from the Middle East and Europe. The DNA did not lie. The oral tradition was telling the truth all along. And the Lemba are not alone. The Beta Israel, the Jews of Ethiopia, known as the Falasha, have maintained a Jewish identity and practice for thousands of years. Their traditions, their dietary laws, their Sabbath observance, their scriptures, all of it predates any contact with European or Middle Eastern Jewish communities. They did not learn to be Jewish from Ashkenazi Jews. They were Jewish before Ashkenazi Jews existed as a population. The Beta Israel are black Africans, and they are among the oldest continuous Jewish communities on earth. Now let us talk about the transatlantic slave trade, because this is where the story gets heavy, and it needs to get heavy because some scholars and a growing number of people doing independent research into ancient history and biblical genealogy have made the argument that the people who were kidnapped from West and Central Africa and enslaved in the Americas were in significant part the descendants of the ancient Israelites, that the dispersions described in the Bible, the scatterings of the Hebrew people as punishment and as consequence of conquest, led a significant population of ancient Israelites into Africa, where they became integrated into various African ethnic groups over centuries and millennia, and that the transatlantic slave trade then swept up these people along with millions of others. This is a contested argument. It is debated fiercely among historians, theologians, and geneticists, but it is not a fringe argument. It is rooted in serious examination of the biblical prophecies of Deuteronomy chapter 28, which describe in extraordinary detail the fate of the Israelites if they turned away from their covenant. Verse 68 says, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way, whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Into Egypt again with ships, brought back into bondage by ship, sold as slaves. There are scholars who read that passage and see a description of the transatlantic slave trade that is almost too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Deuteronomy 28, verse 41. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. The separation of enslaved families, children sold away from parents, parents sold away from children. A defining horror of American chattel slavery, described in a biblical prophecy thousands of years before it happened. Verse 43, the stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. Verse 44, he shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. The economic subjugation of an entire people. The structural poverty enforced through law and custom. The deliberate dismantling of wealth-building capacity across generations, described right there in Deuteronomy. Whether you read this as prophecy, as historical record, or as a later interpolation meant to explain a catastrophe that had already happened, the resonance with the Black American experience is not something that can be easily waved away. The Hebrew Israelite movement, in its many forms and expressions, has been building on this reading of Scripture for over a century. The Church of God and Saints of Christ, founded by William Saunders Crowdy in 1896, was one of the earliest organized expressions of this theology in America. The Commandment Keepers, founded in Harlem in the 1930s by Wentworth Arthur Matthew, built a community of Black Jews in New York City who maintained traditional Jewish observance while insisting on their African Israelite heritage. These were not fringe cultists. These were serious learned people grappling with scripture, history, and the lived reality of Black life in America, and finding in the ancient text a story that spoke directly to their experience. Now, let us address the elephant in the room, the question that people always ask when this conversation comes up. What about the Jewish people who exist today? The Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardic Jews, the Mizrahi Jews. Are they not the descendants of the ancient Israelites? The answer is complicated, and it requires some historical honesty. The Ashkenazi Jewish population of Eastern Europe descended largely from communities that converted to Judaism or adopted Jewish identity during the medieval period, in some cases through mass conversions like the Khazar conversion of the 8th and 9th centuries. In other cases, through the gradual spread of Jewish communities northward and westward from the Mediterranean world. Their genetic profile, as revealed by modern DNA studies, shows a complex mixture of Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, and European ancestry. They are a real people with a real history and a real connection to Jewish tradition. But their phenotype, their pale skin and European features, is not the phenotype of the ancient Israelites. It is the result of centuries of living in Europe and mixing with European populations. The Sephardic Jews, who trace their ancestry to the Iberian Peninsula and the broader Mediterranean world, and the Mizrahi Jews, who come from the Middle East and North Africa, are generally darker in complexion and genetically closer to ancient Near Eastern populations. They represent a more direct physical continuity with the ancient world. But even here, the picture is complicated by millennia of migration, mixture, and historical upheaval. The point is not to delegitimize any living community's identity or practice. The point is to restore the historical truth that the original Israelites, the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the people who built the tabernacle in the wilderness and the temple in Jerusalem, the people who produced Moses and David and Solomon and Isaiah and Jeremiah were dark-skinned people, African and Near Eastern people, people who looked like the people of the African continent, and that this truth was systematically obscured through centuries of European cultural dominance, artistic manipulation, and theological propaganda. The implications of this matter. They matter because representation matters. They matter because when black children grow at church and see a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus staring down at them from a stained glass window, something happens to them. Something gets communicated about whose story this is, whose God this is, whose history counts, whose people matter. And when those same children grow up and discover that the people in that ancient story actually look like them, something else happens. Something powerful, something that cannot be unlearned. The ancient Israelites were not the only people in the ancient world who were black. The ancient Egyptians were black. The ancient Sumerians show evidence of sub-Saharan African genetic influence in their earliest populations. The ancient Phoenicians were a Mediterranean people with significant African ancestry. The ancient world was an African and Near Eastern world. Europe was a relative latecomer to civilization. And when Europe finally arrived, it arrived with ambition and eventually with the power to rewrite the story of everyone who came before it. They renamed things. They repainted things. They translated texts in ways that obscured racial and ethnic identifiers. The Hebrew word Adam, from which we get the name Adam, the first man, comes from a root word meaning red or ruddy, but it is also connected to the word dam, meaning blood. And some scholars have argued that Adam, in its original context, referred to a dark, earth-toned complexion, the color of rich red soil, the color of the ground from which the first human was said to have been formed, the first human, made from the earth, brown and red and dark, like the earth itself. The word Hebrew itself, ivory, in the original, has been connected by some scholars to the ancient Egyptian word apiru, or habiru, which appears in Egyptian texts from the 2nd millennium before the Common Era to describe a class of wandering, stateless people who lived on the margins of Egyptian society. These habiru appear in the Amarna letters. They appear in texts from ancient Mesopotamia. They were not described as a pale-skinned people. They were described as a dark, sun-weathered, wandering people living in the desert regions between Egypt and Canaan. The ancient world left us clues everywhere. In the DNA of living populations, in the ruins of ancient cities, in the paintings and tomb walls, in the words of the biblical text itself. All those clues point in the same direction. They point toward a people who were dark-skinned, African, melanated, black, and they point toward a history that was stolen, repainted, and sold back to the world in a form that served the interests of the people doing the stealing. This is not about hatred. This is not about division. This is not about telling anybody that their faith is invalid or their community does not matter. This is about truth, historical truth, archaeological truth, genetic truth, textual truth. The original Israelites were black people. That is what the evidence says. That is what the text says. That is what the bones in the ground say. That is what the DNA says. And no amount of chapel ceilings and Sunday school illustrations and centuries of deliberate misdirection can make that truth go away. Because truth has a way of surviving. It goes underground. It gets carried in oral traditions and in the memories of grandmothers and in the stubborn persistence of communities that refuse to forget who they were, even when the whole world was telling them they were nobody. It gets carried in the genetics of the Limba people in Zimbabwe. It gets carried in the liturgy of the Beta Israel in Ethiopia. It gets carried in the sermons of preachers in Harlem who looked at the Bible and said, wait a minute, this is our story. It gets carried in the questions of young people who look at the pictures in their Bible and think, something is not right here. Something does not add up. Something does not add up because the math was never right, because the picture was never accurate, because the story was always bigger, darker, older, and more African than they wanted you to know. The original Israelites were black. They were always black. And now you know it too.